Today's episode is a special one because it's our first returning guest. Cory Underwood joins me to discuss US privacy legislation, the global privacy control signal, and how that is underneath a lot of US privacy legislation. We discuss Apple's new SKAN4.0 and the impacts on mobile marketing and mobile attribution. And Cory helps me out of my dream that technology might solve all of this and why that is probably not going to happen, at least not in the near future. I learned a lot, especially since I'm not based in the US. It's really interesting to see what they are developing over there. And Cory is on top of all of that. So without any further ado, here's the episode with Cory Underwood. Cory Underwood, welcome back to Live After GDPR. You are the first return guest of the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me back. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, we have a lot to discuss. So for the people that don't know you yet, you are one of those people who's active online, reading through everything that gets published relating to privacy, especially in Measure Slack. You are very active, sharing your thoughts and also sharing on your own blog. And in our first podcast together, we already covered a lot of topics on privacy regulation in the US, what it might look like, the effects of ITP, all these technical changes. And even though we recorded our first podcast in March of this year, I think we could already fill 3 extra podcasts right now.
Life remains interesting in the privacy space. Definitely a lot of things to think about as we move through the year and go into next.
I want to talk to you about a couple of topics. So I probably think we should start out with GPC. You wrote a great blog post about GPC, basically outlining your thoughts and where it's at right now. And I've seen a lot of questions from a lot of people about what is GPC and how could it be relevant. And actually, I also am not that up to date on it. So I figured, since you wrote such an elaborate blog post on it, it's probably best to just have you explain it to me in your words.
The GPC is the Global Privacy Control, and it is a specification that details how a web browser can communicate that a user has opted out of data collection effectively. So in the specification, it outlines 2 different ways of doing that. You can either inspect a JavaScript property. And so if you want to craft tag manager rules around looking at that signal, you can reference that. There's also a server header that gets set. So if you needed to do something with a server endpoint, it could read and determine the status that way. Where this is notable and different from the previous do not track configuration back in the 2010s is the California Attorney General has said this is a valid opt-out mechanic underneath the California privacy law. And in the case with Sephora that was settled, I'm not sure if the settlement is final, but one of the things that they were cited on was not responding to or honoring the global privacy control for opting out of data collection. So unlike the do not track specification, which nobody decided to follow because there was no reason to, the global privacy control actually has the force of law, at least within the state of California. The other thing to note is because it's like this universal opt-out preference signal, other states that have privacy laws coming up, while it may not be in the initial enforcement, over 2024 and 2025, they're going to implement their own standards, which may mirror California's in regards to the signal. So, at least within the United States, it is likely that California will take the lead. The other states will follow California just for the sake of making things easier on businesses. And the global privacy control will become the standard that sites will have to honor, at least domestically within the states. Now, whether or not that's going to be sufficient for privacy regulation in other countries, I don't know, but that's kind of like the direction that we're seeing, at least here across the pond.
Yeah. Like you mentioned, do not track. I think it was Aurelie who said in the first podcast, like we should have taken the do not track option seriously, and then we might not have been in the situation where we're at right now, right? If we just respected the do not track setting in all these browsers and we actually didn't track, maybe all these privacy regulations wouldn't be necessary. But yet here we are, and this one is actually enforceable, at least now, by California. So that's a main difference. Is it also different from a technical point of view? So is it something that a consumer, so a website visitor, a user configures in their browser or on their operating system? Or
it's within the browser. So currently, it's an option in Firefox. DuckDuckGo and Brave also support it, but it's not in Edge, Chrome, or Safari at this time. Notably, though, California is amending their privacy law currently, and they're going through rulemaking. The rulemaking draft devotes like 5 or 6 pages to how sites need to look at the global privacy control and what they need to do in response when they see it.
It's fair to say that they're taking it pretty seriously as a method to enforce.
Correct. And the thing that the Attorney General has said is consent management on its own isn't sufficient. Because if you look at it, say you have the global privacy control and you see that, and the tag manager finds the variable and it's like, oh, I shouldn't fire these tags. Okay, that stops the collection. But that doesn't do anything to the data that you've already collected. And because it's an opt-out of processing signal, you also need some other mechanism for turning off the processing for any data that you may have already collected.
This part always confuses me because once I get the signal to stop collecting the data, how can I then collect the data that tells me to stop processing the data? Or can I only collect the data that tells me to stop processing it?
Right. So as part of that same signal, you can use that data for propagating back through history and like notifying any service providers, et cetera, that you need to stop doing that. But then you have the technical architecture issue of you don't obviously want to do that on every page, because if someone goes through like 30 something pages of your website, you don't want to kick off that process 30 times because that would get expensive.
So there you have to store that they opted out, which is basically collecting data about them again.
Right. But that's at least that's allowable underneath the draft regulation. You have to maintain enough data that you can say that you're not going to do anything with it. But it's interesting because the law doesn't, it's like if you read the specification for the signal, it covers that use case. It's like you can effectively like denial of service yourself with high enough volume, right? Like there's no control there. So you need to build one, but it's not in the specification. Like, so it's up to the site to figure that out. But in the guidance of the Attorney General, it's like stopping collection is good, but it doesn't go far enough. So any like off-the-shelf solution needs to cover both use cases going forward and looking back through history.
Who is responsible for developing GPC?
I believe you have to look at their website. I believe it's a standards group.
Okay, so it's like it's a non-profit initiative kind of thing.
Let me see here. If we're looking at the full spec, there's people from Brave, DuckDuckGo, Consumer Reports, the Washington Post. Like it's a series of editors. There's like a GitHub repo that you can go and look at pull requests and open issues and make suggestions for it, etc. Yeah.
It's not owned by the government. It is an open source initiative by well, by the names you just named, like these are companies that have like privacy as their USP, sort of, or at least some of them.
Pretty much. Because it's not a specific company, it's more along the lines of like the W3C, and how I don't think it's actually an official effort underneath that, but I'm saying it's being developed along those lines, right?
Because the fact that legislation is being based upon it, like I was thinking two things. So the one thing that came up with me is like, under the GDPR, I feel like this is missing, sort of. Like it's all open to interpretation on how to do it, and then eventually, you'll have to basically figure out if you're doing correctly by going through the whole process, and then hopefully you don't get sued, or like it turns out well. So a signal would be nice, right? Just a simple on-off switch, so to say. But then again, I do understand like the technical complexity of building that and maintaining that. And if the government itself would do that, or government, or Europe in our case, right? That also, brings certain issues. But then this group, they also have their, it could be a conflict of interest, so to say.
The universal preference signal, actually, in like a lot of the regulation, it doesn't call out the GPC specifically, but the Attorney General said the GPC qualifies as an example of this. So it doesn't mention it in the regulation by name. However, a lot of the different regulations that have clauses about universal preference signals have very specific requirements over the type of entity that maintains the signal for it to be even up for consideration.
So actually, GPC is basically the current best example of what the law specifies, but they could switch it out in the future as long as it matches the spec that was listed out in the law.
Correct.
Okay, gotcha. That makes more sense. I do feel that if this is done properly, it would make life easier on businesses, right? If this spec, if there's like a technical suite to work with, sort of, where you can basically tie all your tools to, it does make life easier for businesses to be compliant, right?
Correct. And like, at least within the States, California and Colorado, they have their own regulations that were defined by the relevant supervisory body. And those are much more prescriptive than what we've seen out of Europe with like the GDPR. So it's like very clear, like, here is how you do that. And that's what you're going to be judged by.
From the business side of things, I think like that's a good thing. Like there's so much questioning around the interpretation of personal data, to start with, right? Like that as an example. So and how to implement basically all these concepts in Europe. That I feel like a more prescriptive approach might not actually be a bad thing. But it will be interesting to see how this rolls out. So California, this is already currently active, right? And Sephora basically got fined.
Yeah. So in 2020, the law went into effect, right? So the CCPA. And then in the summer of 2021, the Attorney General issued a press release that said that global privacy control is an example of the opt-out signal underneath the CCPA. You need to follow it. But if you built your site around the initial rollout and then you didn't touch it since, you are probably not in compliance.
The early movers that did their best to be compliant might have to do some extra work to make that work.
Indeed.
So next states that are also gonna roll this out in the US, or that are rolling out privacy regulation based on GPC.
So they haven't decided on their standard yet for the universal preference signal. It could be GPC simply because California is already using it. But I know that Colorado and Connecticut both have clauses that go into effect in either 24 or 25.
A little bit of time left, but it's inching closer.
In the United States, a lot of the different privacy laws have different cutoffs. So certain clauses become inactive at certain points, and certain clauses become active at certain points. The universal preference signal, just because it's so much more complex, is an example of something that has a delayed start. But like, for example, there are examples of what that looks like as far as becoming deactive. I know that, for example, in January, California no longer needs to give you a warning before they file for a motion. Because like their cure period where they send you the letter and you have like X number of days to fix it, like that has been repealed underneath the new amendment. And then I know that in 2024, Connecticut repeals their 60-day cure period in December 31st of that year. So while Connecticut starts this summer, coming up in 23, you have like 18 months really to kind of get your house in order before like the 60-day warning that you're not compliant goes away. So it's dangerous and strongly not recommended for anyone to rely on that cure period being present, and they should probably just take it more seriously to begin with.
I feel like the Sephora fine got some people, woke some people up, right?
It definitely caused a lot of conversation to happen. It definitely did. Because the big thing that was kind of an open question around California's law when it was initially rolled out was what the definition of sale of data is. And a lot of lawyers took that as to be, we got paid actual cash for sharing data with somebody. And the Attorney General has made it clear it's cash or other valuable consideration. So it's more broad. So if you're getting any sort of benefit from sharing the data, then that probably applies to you. That is not universal amongst all the states, though. 2 of the state privacy laws going into effect in 23 actually still have the monetary compensation clause. So it's going to be challenging for businesses to come up with like a unified view of things.
I was just thinking like, so one of the benefits compared to the GDPR is like basing it on some sort of signal, like we just mentioned, like for instance, what GPC could be. But then one of the downsides is handling how different states will have a different take on these things. How would you handle that, like from a technical point of view? Like if you sell to the entire United States, you gotta do IP lookup and basically change your tech infrastructure, or you're gonna go with the strictest regulation as like a blanket approach for all states?
Well, it could go either way. I kind of worry that we're going to end up in a situation similar to how insurance works in the United States, where like you get your insurance statement and then like there's 4 pages at the end of it. And it's like, if you're in this state, here's all the additional clauses that apply to you, or here's your additional rights under the state of Massachusetts, for example. And we could actually see it go that way. I don't necessarily advise that if it can be avoided, just because it increases all of the overhead and the complexity of like the entire compliance thing, right? So you would want to, I would advise, for sake of saving costs and time, standardizing on whatever the strictest one is that meets the broadest amount of use cases. Like only build something custom if you need it, essentially.
In your opinion, what is currently the state with the strictest privacy regulation, or will be in the near future?
Right. So that would currently, It varies, actually. California has the most prescriptive set of regulations, but Colorado probably has the strictest view on what a data protection assessment looks like.
So it would still be an it depends. We still have to do a mix and match.
The fine structure is different too. So like in California, for an unintentional violation, it's currently at $2,500. For intentional, it's $7,500. Other states just start at $7,500. Colorado starts at $20,000. So like your fine structure and the risk varies dramatically between the states too.
Yeah, and that will also, of course, influence the decisions companies will make on that. Is there a push for a federal or a nationwide privacy regulation that would make your life easier?
There is. So there was a bill that made it out of committee and went up for a floor vote in the House, but it didn't get a floor vote prior to session ending. So it has bipartisan support. So both like conservatives and more liberal facing folks say that this is probably the way to go. California is rejecting it because the law is preemptive, so it would override California's laws, and it's not as strong as California's laws. So even though it's stronger than the data privacy law in like 49 other states, California is saying that they don't want it to overrule theirs. So rather than be a ceiling, they want it to be a floor.
I do get that if you've been working on it yourself, but like from a business point of view, it would be nice if you could have a, I think a lot of US businesses operate cross states, and this is really a hassle if you have to, especially if you're a small business, if you have to, make that work. It would be nice if it was just one set of rules to play everywhere.
Right, but even if that was the case, I think there's still like in a lot of the existing data privacy law, there's cutouts for it's your personal data and it has to be treated this way, unless it's health data, in which case, like the health HIPAA might apply, right? Or they're under 13, then COPA may apply, or it's like all these different things. So it's still contextual even in the United States, even within the state of California, because if there's a more specific law in place for how that specific kind of data has to be handled, that takes precedence.
This is something that over the talks I've had with people, like it's becoming more clear to me that the conflict of technology and legislation, like legislation is created after the fact to regulate something that we feel as a society is might be going in the wrong direction if we don't regulate it. And then often technology is actually built to get us to a next step. So they're like conflicting in the way they work, where technology tries to build forward to solve something, and legislation always tries to work backward based on things that already happen. And I feel like it's so hard to make them work together well.
I would say that's probably true, because you don't necessarily know you need rules around it until like you see what goes wrong with it.
Yeah, which makes sense, right? So, and I'm not saying legislation is not good in the sense of course we need, as a society we grow, we figure out new stuff, and then suddenly we build something. We're like, maybe we need a set of rules around that before we start abusing it, right? So that part totally makes sense to me. But then from a technical point of view, like the actually put it into practice, right? Those set of rules. That's usually where it really becomes so difficult, especially for companies that do not have dedicated, they cannot allocate that kind of resources to it to solve those issues.
So like back 20 years ago, there was no real major laws around the web, for example. But now web developers need to be aware of like accessibility laws, of privacy laws. In some cases, they have to be aware of having specific things such as like unsubscribe links in different regions, check boxes either checked or not checked based off what exactly it is those things are doing. It's just become a much more complex profession.
Yeah, and it all needs to be interconnected also. All those things you just described, like now, so basically having an unsubscribe box, okay, we kind of fixed that because every email tool now has it integrated, right? Like usually what we end up doing is we turn it into software and then everybody can use it. And then that's just the barrier of entry, so to say, like every tool has that. But now with these regulations, what we're actually saying is, oh yeah, if somebody now unsubscribes over there, then in all your systems everywhere, we want to update that user and unsubscribe them and send them all the data you got about them and tell them that you deleted it. Like, which like from a technical point of view, if you hear that, you're like, okay, we got some work cut out for us.
And I think this is the downside that you see of having like a bunch of external third-party services, right? Like they have their specific API interfaces and like that's what they do and that's all they do. And so as things have to come through and you have to propagate that out to like all of the different places you may have sent the data, all of those different companies have to build their own architecture for how to handle that. And some of them are more forward thinking than others in that regard. And there's a lot of vendors out there today that still don't have any plans that they publicly announce for how they're going to comply with a lot of this stuff. And even on a technical level, there's a lot of vendors that sell software packages that use cookies that are impacted by like intelligent tracking prevention. And that's been in place for years and they still haven't fixed their product to handle that use case yet. So it's difficult for a company that doesn't have a technical team, I think, just because things are changing really quickly. But that doesn't mean that your particular vendor set is optimal going forward. But if you have no one to review it and tell you, you might not know that you need to change, even though staying with that vendor may ultimately increase your liability.
Yeah, well, and I think the argument from the let's call it the privacy side of things would be like, yeah, and then they'll get fined, and then people will wake up and they'll it's a process, right? Like I see that as well. Like it's a multi-year, probably multi-decade process. But I feel like it's also a case of technical debt, right? Like we have built systems upon systems upon systems, and now these regulations go through all of them. They don't just touch the top layer of what we've built in the last year. They touch everything was built on from the ground up, which also means that in order to really comply, you actually need to re-envision a lot of what has been built from the ground up as well.
I agree. And I think like enterprise data warehouse teams are coming to grips with this currently because a lot of the new laws coming into effect have like data retention periods. Like it's not enough that you're going to like people they used to stand up a data warehouse and they'd be like, it's append only, like nothing ever gets deleted. And like that doesn't fly in the new world, right? So what does that look like for company?
Yeah. I do feel like something like GPC, and I haven't invested enough time in it to actually understand it thoroughly, but a universal signal on the client side, which is actively enforced, is probably the way to go compared to other solutions we've seen so far, because it is the only actual place where what this is all about, which is personal data, which is about the data subject, right? It's the only place they can actually actively control, right? They can set the signal there, like, no, I do not track, but then enforce do not track, right? No, I don't want to be tracked. And using that signal throughout the tech stack could be the building block of something that scales, right? If you know that this signal is always the starting point of whatever you're going to do down the line, that feels like a good starting point to have like a standard for that.
I think so. The California law is a little bit weird in how it handles it. So, for example, if you have the signal running, you need to stop sending data and opt them out of the sale or processing of their data for any third party that the site is communicating with. But that is a very specific legal context underneath the California law. So essentially, you're going to send data to a company. You have to have a contract to do that. Depending on the terms of your contract and the purpose for sending the data, they may qualify as like a service provider or processor. You can continue to send data to your service provider / processor, even in the face of the opt-out signal, because of the different restrictions in those contracts. However, you cannot designate another company as a service provider if they're doing things like remarketing. And that actually says that in the regulations. Under those scenarios, they're a third party. So then the GPC signal applies to them. And you have to stop sending data to third parties. So there's like a specific legal context for any vendor classifications that you have. And if the regulations are adopted as is, the service that other company is providing to you may force them into one bucket or the other. But then there's actual legitimate contractual obligations for both scenarios that have to be spelled out. And that's not something that I think a lot of people are looking at today. But that's a pretty common feature amongst the United States privacy laws going into effect. But that means maybe you don't just like add a tag to your site without doing sort of like any sort of due diligence. I'm just saying that might be a good plan going forward.
I think that's probably a good plan going forward everywhere, right? Like just stop adding random JavaScript to your websites. That's a call to everybody listening to this podcast. So maybe do you think it's naive of me to think that I envision a solution that is purely technical, where the signal from, so the setting in the client browser, client device, mobile phone, glasses, whatever we figure out in the future, right? Don't care. The signal from that device will inform it all downstream. Like we build the entire data processing environment downstream and the enforcement of all of that based on that signal. Because the reason I feel like this is the way forward is I feel all these contracts, although I get that's how the legal world works, the internet is so big, you're not going to be able to enforce it all. You know that, like, you need more lawyers than people on earth to enforce it all. So it never made a lot of sense to me to rely on those contracts. So my feeling is, why, if we have technology can make something a 1 or a 0, right? And it can enforce it. Why don't we enforce the technology to change, to respect the do not track signal or the GPC signal or the whatever signal we figure out next?
And I think what's difficult is a lot of the signals in place with like the browser, for example, serve double duty. It's not just delivering the experience. It's been co-opted by the advertising industry to like deliver advertising, right? So That's why we have issues in like Europe with the GDPR and like IP addresses, for example.
That's how the internet works, unfortunately. But
right, yeah. So at some point, you need to have the data transfer, because otherwise you're not going to get a page back when you type in the URL. And the issue that I see is regulation really tries to like differentiate between proper uses of something and improper uses of something. But I mean, the fact is, like, you still need the IP address to get the information back. And you're classified as personal data, but I still need to process it 100% of the time to serve the web pages. So it's hard when things get classified certain ways, but they're required in like nearly 100% of use cases. And it's just some of those use cases might be less desirable than others, but we can't not have an IP address, because we still need a way of getting the data from A to B. So I kind of wonder, like, if we assume the JPC as a standard gets rolled out, vendors will eventually develop support for it, probably, especially if they start getting hit with fines. But I mean, like, it's not just the way the regulation is faced is essentially, if you include a tag on your website, you're liable. And underneath the California law, there's different things that you have to do, like assessments of your vendors. Otherwise, you can't use the legal defense, well, I thought they were doing everything properly. They're like, you can't say that you thought they were doing everything properly unless you're validating that they're doing everything properly at least every so often. So I don't know. I think it's going to be rough. It would be good for it to do that, but there's a lot of software that's been built. And refactoring all of that to look at different signals is not a minor undertaking. And some of this stuff has been in place like 20, 30 years. And chances of people at the company even knowing how those systems work any longer, probably fairly low, outside of like some diehard, I'm going to work here the rest of my life type folks.
Get some people out of retirement, dust off their programming books.
It's super expensive and it's very time consuming. And then you really need someone, because a lot of the laws nowadays have like security requirements in them too, right? So you really need like a security engineer when you're going through and rebuilding all these systems, and you probably want a privacy engineer, at least someone who understands the privacy space in enough detail that they can flag, hey, maybe we shouldn't do that way before you build it, because it's cheaper to fix it in design than it is after it's like in production.
Yeah, I think so. So I think maybe like what I started out with, like my vision, that's never going to happen in the sense of there's too much legacy. But then I think the next best thing is privacy by design and by default, right? So if new technology that gets built does get built with these things in mind, then give it another 30 years, until all the old stuff is deprecated, and then we're at a better spot.
Right. And I think anything new being, the standards applying to anything new is important, because otherwise we're never going to get out of the situation we're in. It's a long tail, probably heavily supported by enforcement action, to get legacy companies or companies with like a legacy architecture to update.
Yeah.
Because it's hard to sell that to like an executive team, right? Like, why do we need to rebuild the website? Or the entire infrastructure of the whole back end? Like, why do we need to do that? It's like, well, that's what the regulation says we need to do. It's like, well, we'll look at that when we get sued is often the case. But I mean, Sephora's settlement is not just the fine. Sephora has to fix all the issues, and Sephora has to stand up and maintain a privacy program for 2 years and make periodic reports to the state of California on how they're still being compliant. So it's like the fine's only a part of that, but like the investigation and like standing up the systems and the compliance and the transparency and stuff, that's super disruptive.
Yeah, and expensive.
So it's like you can do it on your time, or you can do it when the government says you need to do it, but then that's on their time.
Yeah. Because I can imagine that the amount of consultants that Sephora is going to have to hire to get this done is also not going to be cheap. So the price tag is definitely bigger than the initial fine. That's true, and that's a good signal to give. I think like that's even the things you just mentioned. I didn't know that, but I think that's even better than the initial fine. Like the fine grabs a headline, that's good, but then making them basically giving them a house arrest, of 2 years, and making them come back and better themselves. That's probably more important than the initial fine.
Right. I mean, the FTC, so the Federal Trade Commission in the United States, hit Twitter with a $150 million fine a couple months ago because they discovered that they were using two-factor authentication phone numbers as a key for targeted advertising delivery. And so they were telling users, hey, give us this number. We're only going to use it for two-factor authentication. And then they were using it for marketing.
Nice growth hack.
And so the FTC is like, you violated our previous order, so now the fine's higher.
You understand how it happened, right? There's some ambitious growth hacker that's like, hey, we could just pick this up. Yeah, we could just pick this up, hash it, send it to Facebook, match it, grab those users, remarket them. Easy win. But yeah, those are the practices that we don't want to do anymore. So yeah, it's good that they get fined for that. Let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about Apple's latest developments, because Apple has been, promoting privacy as a USP for a couple of years now. I think in our first podcast together, we touched upon a lot of ITP and some ATT stuff, and now Apple has, I feel, given a little bit back or improved upon the way people can do attribution, in this case for app installs, right? What they call the SKAN or SKAdNetwork. Right. So they released on October 24th. So it's like early November here. So maybe 2 weeks ago now. Their 4.0 version of this. And two things really help advertisers here. So first is like support for multiple conversions. They can get up to 3 postbacks for who installed the campaign, like the app from a campaign. And then they also have SKAdNetwork for web ads. So attribute web advertising that directs to the App Store product pages. And so if you are trying to figure out, like, is your advertising working for app installs and what that return on investment is, they're helping you get to that number easier than they have done previously. I think so. Previously, you could send a post back, so a signal back to your attribution software, but you could only send one. Correct. So the issue for a lot of app developers was, okay, we could send something that the app was installed, but probably somewhere in let's say you have a game, right? Somewhere in the game, you want people to upgrade to the paid tier of the game or something like that. And then maybe once they're in that, you want to upgrade them again. So there's a couple of key moments in the life cycle which you want to attribute back to your original acquisition campaign. And they could only report on them like in aggregate, but not tied back to the campaign. They would only have one post back that would tie it back to the campaign. And now they have 3. Right. And there's like a series of
priority on like what conversions within the network look like. 'Cause usually you get like the highest quality ones back, and because like if you send 20, it's only going to give you a subset of those, right? But it still has a lot of the same issues that data is not real time anymore. There's a delay, and if there's nothing, like if the source data can't be significantly anonymized, like you're probably not going to get it because it's a privacy first design. So they did give you more tools, and you do have more capacity for doing identification, and particularly like web to app identification. And so like all of that reporting. But I mean, like, it's not plug and play. You're still doing quite a bit of development effort to get there, even if you're working with like an advertiser network. They're doing the work. Then as you build out ads or whatnot, you may have to supply more information or configuration settings to get that to work like you did.
Yeah, I feel like the mobile attribution space already was more complicated, like to begin with, right? Like you would always have something like Apps Flyer or some Adjust or one of those tools implemented, and I feel like probably a lot of the heavy lifting is going to be on their end, on your ad tech partner, so to say. But it's definitely not plug and play.
Right. And like if you were to go into Apple's documentation on it, like it is developer documentation. Like it's not directed at marketers. So the benefits can be realized by marketers, but the documentation is not at all written for them.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a gap to bridge there. I want to get back to two things you said. So there's a delay, because I'm interested in the technology, because I feel like what we're seeing here could also be implemented perhaps in other systems on web attribution in the future. So Apple has a delay which is randomized, right? Because basically the reason why they have a delay is because if you would have an immediate unique hit timestamp, it could help you identify a user, and thus privacy would not be preserved. So they have like a randomized timer, right, in which they will actually give you the event. And then there's a threshold for sending it back, which is a little bit like in Google Analytics, where you can only get an audience segment if you have more than, I don't know what it is, 500 or 1,000 users. So basically to hide in the crowd, right? So you need X amount of users or X amount of X amount of unique events grouped together, so that you're no longer basically able to stitch them back to a single user.
Correct. So I believe that the look back window is somewhere between 24 and 48 hours. But then specific kinds of events have different cutoffs, right? So like if you want to know if the ad network presented a StoreKit rendered ad, they have 30. The user has 30 days to install the app. But if you're not trying to tie it back to a campaign, then you can get a post back for 60 days. So there's like different time windows on how long you can get certain kinds of signals. But the total delay from the final conversion update to receiving a post back is somewhere between 24 and 48 hours. So if you're looking for like that real time, I need to modify something multiple times within a day, this is not going to get you there.
No, that's gone, basically.
Much like, the Google ads and Facebook look back windows for advertising, it used to be 60, 90 days, and now it's like not. It's 30 or less.
Yeah, so that's a new reality.
The long look back windows are probably a thing of the past in most cases.
The 4.0 version does give a bit more, which I was interested, like that triggered me. I don't do a lot for our clients about mobile attribution. But I do follow along because I do think the space is interesting, and I feel like a lot that happens there might actually also be rolled out to web. The only issue is enforcement. Like for Apple, it's easier to enforce on iOS, whereas with Safari they have a smaller market share on web. So it's it's harder to get there. To make whatever they do an industry standard, so to say. But the fact that they gave more does signal that they are working together with looking at like, okay, we want to preserve privacy, right? So you're still not going to be able to tie this back to a unique user. So we're preserving user privacy, but we are going to give you marketers better signals to optimize your ad campaigns, which I feel is also going to be a win for the user, right? Because like it's not useful to the company to show a relevant ad, and it's also not useful to a consumer to see an irrelevant ad. So there's a win-win on that side. Do you have a high hopes for like 5.0, 6.0, 7.0, like that they will continue to move in that direction, that it will continue to become better?
I think that they're going to continue working on it because it's in their interest to support it, right? Because like if people can't tell their advertising is causing their apps to be installed, like then they're probably not going to do the advertising. And that ultimately means less money for Apple in a lot of cases. What is notable, though, is the different versions of the SKAdNetwork. They get signed to different iOS versions, right? So, for example, while SKAdNetwork is in version 4, if someone's still on like iOS 15, like they can't leverage it because it needs functionality in iOS 16.1. So they can develop the network faster than people upgrade.
Which is also a hassle for the ad tech because they have to support multiple
versions of like, because I mean, if you're only getting one post back, that's different than 3. So
yeah, so you have to make a decision. Like if you're on iOS, if you're not on iOS 16.1, then we only go for the most important post back, and otherwise we're gonna spread it across those 3 post backs. And yeah, I think it's also super interesting because you only unlock these levels of postbacks after you have enough volume, right? So there's like a threshold to meet. So it also really becomes a game of your campaigns need to be of a certain size in order to actually make full usage of those postbacks. So it also kind of incentivizes them to make their campaigns touch more volume, so to say, because otherwise, you wouldn't unlock the functionalities basically that you would want for that. So it's a fun game to see how this will play out between mobile advertisers and in this case Apple.
Correct. Like the mobile app space is super complicated, and they have a lot of documentation on what that looks like and the different time windows that different data becomes available in. And I can understand that marketing may not be happy with those windows, but that is what we have to work with. So I think it's just getting everyone on the same page. Like, and I think this is going to be the biggest challenge for marketing agencies is what you were able to do in like the late 2010s and what you are able to do today is completely different. And that will even be more different next year as different privacy regulation starts to get layered in. So if you're a media agency, your attribution is probably getting worse. And now you have additional hoops to jump through to activate on data audiences. So those companies have to evolve or they're going to be left out, because a lot of the laws that are going into effect in the States, those contracts that you set up actually require the vendor that the contract is with to be compliant with that regulation, even if otherwise they wouldn't have to be. So like if you're a California company and you hire a media agency, because you as a company have to comply with the CCPA, they have to comply with the CCPA in regards to any data they handle on your behalf.
Yeah, that's going to be important for both the agencies and the clients to take into account.
Right. It's not just a client issue. As agencies, you're going to have to make adjustments, either in your contracts or how you handle data, or both.
I think we wanted to touch upon one more thing before we end. So you mentioned that there's a difference between measuring and activating data, and how that will change for companies in the US over the next year?
Sure. So several of the different privacy regulations state that targeted advertising does not include activities such as like campaign attribution or measurement. So if that's the case, you can have the pixel on your site. You don't need to say, can I have consent? You can send the data to those places as long as you have the appropriate agreements, right? Without getting express user consent. The issue is a lot of those same laws have conditions where if you start to activate on that data to like handle advertising based off behavioral information or affinity, etc., on websites other than your own, you probably need express consent for that. Now, technically, it's the same pixel. It's just doing both things, right? So if you start requiring express consent because you want to activate on that data, now people have the opportunity to opt out of the reporting side of it. So that's going to have to be a thing that companies have to think through.
Let's take an example. I have a Google Ads pixel on my web shop. On the conversion, it fires that there's a transaction. This is allowed, right?
Right. So like under Virginia's law, you can do this without needing express consent.
But Google uses the signal it gets on my transaction pixel for smart bidding. Would that be activation or not? Or maybe?
You would probably need to talk with a lawyer, but I would be inclined to think yes. And as soon as it switches from reporting to activation, that's when you start needing consent under some of these laws. But it also, some of the laws classify targeted advertising as a high-risk activity. And so if you're going to engage in targeted advertising, now you need data protection assessments. So you need your lawyer to go through and work with your privacy people to figure out things such as like, where's the data stored and what could go wrong if unauthorized people get access to it, and what is the potential harm to consumers, and what is all the mitigating strategies that we can put into place, and which ones do we put in place, and all of those things prior to the collection starting. So it's not as simple as the marketing agency being like, hey, here's a tag I need you to install on the website, and then the developer going and doing that. Now there's actual legitimate business processes that need to be stood up, as far as it needs to at least go through a privacy review if you're sending data to a third party.
I think we touched upon that. I think in the end, that's a good thing, right? That we start to create those processes and start to think about that. But I think that it is going to have a big impact, like especially the example I just gave to you, like all advertising platforms are moving towards some form of black box smart bidding based upon, upon their pixel. So if that counts as activating data, then they might want to reintroduce the old simple measurement pixel that doesn't do any smart bidding, because that will be allowed to be implemented without specific consent. And it's just really good for companies to be aware of this, that this change is coming, because every trend points towards data activation, right? And that's logical, because we don't just want to collect data, we want to activate it. We want to create value with that data. So, but it's good to keep that in mind, that if you want to steer away from GDPR like cookie banners everywhere, you probably want to have separate systems for pure measurement and activation of data.
Right. But I think the big thing that's going to hit American companies is a lot of them don't have consent banners because they don't sell to California potentially. And so they don't need them. And except now they do potentially need them, because as the different states come online, if you meet the applicability thresholds for that state, now you have a bunch of additional overhead in regards to how you collect and handle data use. And that likely means that you need to stand up a consent framework and all of the stuff that comes with that. And that's going to be new for a lot of organizations.
Well, welcome to Europe, guys. Welcome to the consent banner hell that we're in.
Yeah, it's not as strict as Europe because a lot of it seems to apply when you're starting to do that activation across other websites that you don't own. Whereas in Europe, it's like all the cases, even on the websites you do own.
Yeah, and even if you just measure.
Yeah, it's not as strict, but we're basically gonna see, I predict, the same issues that we've seen with Europe and like getting all the businesses on the same page. And it's gonna depend, I think, largely on how aggressive the different attorney generals are in enforcement. But it is notable that California has their own agency whose like sole purpose in existence is to monitor and enforce California's privacy law. So one would assume that they would be more proactive than not. And I think that's another good call out is Sephora got caught in an enforcement sweep. And so the attorney general was actually going out and like testing sites to see if they were compliant proactively. And you don't see that so much in Europe.
No, I think everything here is based upon complaints, right? Which is why none of your business proactively filed complaints everywhere. So that's definitely interesting that they're actively chasing in the US.
Right, and so that kind of it's a different risk threshold, right? It's like we know they're doing sweeps because they filed court cases saying that they were doing sweeps. So it's not just I can do what I want until someone cares enough to complain and then the attorney general cares enough to file a motion. It's the attorney general may just decide to review your site and then decide to send you a letter.
In Europe, there's a lot of voices saying that enforcement of GDPR has not been, not been done well enough, or has not scared enough companies into complying. Maybe in the US, we're going to see the results of taking that other approach and being really tight on regulation and on enforcing it.
You can definitely see the states that took it more seriously because 3 of the states are more consumer friendly and 2 of the states are more business friendly. But as a company that sells nationally, you probably are going to act as soon as the first cases come through, regardless of where they're at.
Yeah, from a risk perspective, that's probably smart.
Yeah,
to take that approach.
I'm going to say that does mean though that you're running out of time. We're at the time of recording, you're 2 months out from 23, and that's when California and Virginia go into effect. And you're 8 months out from July, and that's when Colorado and Connecticut go into effect.
There's not a lot of time left.
Nope. Not a lot of time. And agencies that specialize in like data privacy work,
they're booked.
Going to be harder to hire the closer we get to those deadlines.
For the foreseeable future, I think lawyers that specialize in privacy regulation and just privacy professionals in general have job security. Personally, I hope we can still fix it with technology like we discussed earlier, but I'm not so sure. At least for the foreseeable future, we'll go down this path. It looks like. Any other things you're working on right now? Things you want to share? Blog posts coming up, or what's the main thing on your mind right now as we close off the podcast?
Biden did sign an executive order to tentatively restore data transfers between the United States and Europe, and we're waiting on Europe's response to that. And so either in the new year, companies are going to have a lot of stuff to celebrate, or we're going to face a new reality where that's probably not going to be as quick of a fix. And even if it was to be accepted, there's no guarantee that it's not going to survive court challenges. So like we're going to it's a big unknown currently, and I don't feel we're likely to have that resolved before mid 2023.
Because I think they're expecting Europe to respond in March, something like that.
Yeah, early spring.
Do you want to make a bet live on the podcast? What do you think? What do you think is going to happen?
I think Europe may be inclined to accept it, and I think it will immediately be challenged in court.
Me too, 100%. I feel like the lobbying going on by big tech is probably enough to make Europe accept it, and then it's going to be fought in court, probably by none of your business, and then we'll be recording another podcast again.
That is probably what I think will happen.
Yeah, unfortunately, we're going to continue this limbo. Where can people find you online? Where should they follow you?
The best place to get in touch with me is probably either the Measure Slack, and you can join through measure.chat, or on my website at cunderwood.dev.
Yes, we'll link to the articles we discussed as well. And thanks for sharing your knowledge again and coming back on the podcast. Hopefully we can make this a trilogy someday.
Definitely. Would be happy to continue talking privacy stuff with you.